This is a visual record of my trip to Normandy that took place September 2019. Our first stop was at the German cemetery at La Combe. This cemetery houses over 22,000 bodies of German soldiers killed in the Normandy fighting. Interestingly, the German tank ace Michael Wittmann is also buried here, but sadly we didn't have time to find his grave. In common with most war graves, it's beautifully kept and the lawns are well manicured. Now here we are at Ferme Delaunay. This was to be our base of operations for the week ahead, and is based in Saint-Côme-de-Mont. Saint-Côme-de-Mont was the one of the heart of the paratroop drop zones, and the area around here saw a huge amount of action on those first early June days. Now, after we had dumped our bags, the owner, Richard, suggested we take a look at the rear of the property, because on the night of the 6th of June, Ferme Delaunay was the home to a squad of German Fallschirmjäger, and they put up pretty stiff resistance. Richard pointed out what had been a window in the barn that the Germans had used as a sniper position. And with a slightly closer shot there, you can see the position peppered by bullet holes. And so to the first day. The first port of call was Saint-Mère-Église. Here I am outside the very famous church with the main square behind me there. And if we look a little closer, yes, Red Buttons is still stuck up there, poor fella. Now, this is a medieval monument that's in the square opposite the church at Saint-Mère-Église, and this too bears the scar of the fighting in the town square that night. Now, on the night of the 6th of June, many American paratroopers landed not only in the square, but also in the gardens and the houses around Saint-Mère-Église. This house is particularly famous. And the railings still bear the scars of the action of that night. Indeed, here's some other photographs of damaged railings throughout Normandy. And yes, that is a 30 cal bullet stuck in the railing, still there after 70-something years. And this is the interior of the rather beautiful church at Saint-Mère-Église. And here's the stained glass window that was created in honour of the paratroopers who liberated Saint-Mère-Église. Ah yes, the Sherman M4 tank. I really do need one of these for my back garden. So after wandering around the town for a short while, we visited the really excellent museum at Saint-Mère-Église. It's got some wonderful exhibits inside. One thing I had no idea, cornflakes, Rice Krispies, bran flakes for GIs? I really had no idea that such a thing existed. These surely must have been part of B rations. And so to the bridge at La Fière. This was somewhere I've been wanting to visit for some while, having done quite a bit of research into what took place there. Now, the bridges at La Fière and Chef de Pont were vital objectives. To enable the American troops to get off successfully from Utah Beach and into the Cotentin Peninsula. But also to prevent Germans getting to the beaches. This is the rather lovely bronze monument come diorama of the action at La Fière. Now, we are in the American positions, looking out towards the village of Coquigny. And if you noticed off to your right to the very left, there is a small chapel. Now, this is where the Germans were largely based. And you have to remember that where you can see the cows are now, all this was completely flooded. Okay, I'm now on the other side in the little hamlet of Coquigny, where the Germans were holed up. And I'm now looking back at the American positions, and I've annotated the picture to make things a little clearer. Here we have my chum Mark Bailey reading the description of some of the action that took place there at Coquigny. This is the chapel, and here's a period picture taken just a short while after the action of a couple of GIs with what appears to be German bodies in the background. The fighting at Lafayette Bridge lasted for a full 3 days, with the Americans first of all taking the bridge and then being beaten back by the Germans before moving back to retake the bridge. At one point the Germans sent 3 captured French char tanks, but these were quickly dispatched with a bazooka. There were many displays of outstanding bravery at Lafayette Bridge, probably none more so than that of Private Charles de Glopper. Upon seeing one of his comrades had been injured and the medic could not get to him because of the German fire, he stood up with his BAR, Browning automatic rifle, and kept firing, keeping the German's head down so the medic could reach his colleague. He kept firing and reloading until finally he ran out of ammunition and was sadly cut down by a German fusillade. For this action he was awarded the Medal of Honor. Inside the chapel at Coquigny is a stained glass window to the memory of those brave soldiers of the 82nd Airborne who gave their lives in defence of the bridge at Lafayette. This is the statue to Lieutenant General James Gavin. Saint-Marie-du-Mont. This village was heavily fought over on the night of the 6th of June, largely by the 506th Parachute Infantry Regiment. Now this is me standing in front of a World War I memorial, and here's a picture of members of Easy Company standing in front of the same statue all those years ago. And if you look behind, you can see the buildings really haven't changed that much. Now this is the famous water pump in Saint-Marie-du-Mont. I'm sure you've all seen lots of pictures of this. On the night of the 6th of June, an American paratrooper hid behind it and was taking pot shots at the Germans who were around the church right opposite. The Germans, for the life of them, they couldn't work out where the shots were coming from, and he managed to take out quite a few of them before making good his escape. Now this is the interior of the rather lovely church at Saint-Marie-du-Mont. Previously the Germans had been using the bell tower as an artillery spotting position, and it was some while after the capture of the village that the priest heard coughing coming from the confessional booth, and with the aid of a couple of American soldiers investigated the noise and discovered 2 rather terrified Germans hiding in the confessional box. Utah Beach. The sun coming through the clouds that morning really was a lovely, lovely sight. This is a view looking east down the beach, and one of the main draws off of Utah Beach, and now a view looking to the west. Now this is a monument to the Higgins boat, invented by Andrew Higgins. The Higgins boat was used extensively throughout Europe, and probably even more so in the Pacific. General Eisenhower once said, "The Higgins boat damn near won us the war." The museum at Utah Beach is well worth a visit. It's absolutely crammed with exhibits, including this rather splendid B-26 Martin Marauder. Another quick view of Utah Beach dunes there. These are probably the only dangerous thing you're likely to find on Utah Beach these days. Now, according to the guy in the museum, this is a guard sentry shelter, primarily not designed to protect you from shelling, but from the elements. Imagine if you happen to guard a stretch of beach in the middle of winter with the wind whipping across. It's a very basic kind of construction, but it would do the job. And an American Sherman tank, or more correctly, a Firefly. The Sherman tank was originally equipped with a 75mm gun, but throughout North Africa and Italy, it had been found to be somewhat ineffective against stugs and panthers. So it was refitted with a 76mm gun, which it proved more than a match, even for the legendary German Tiger tank. Breakour Manor. Now, Breakour Manor will be familiar to anybody who's watched Band of Brothers or indeed played Call of Duty. Sadly, by now, as you can see, the heavens had opened. The position of the German guns is diagonally across the field from this memorial, and indeed the barn made famous in Band of Brothers is actually really very, very close indeed. With this annotated picture, you can see the route that Easy Company took to get to the German guns, and Captain Winter's strategy, or was he still lieutenant then, I'm not sure, but his strategy was so successful in the destruction of these 155mm guns that it is still taught in West Point today. Now, this is Breakour Manor itself. It's privately owned and not open to the public. So, to be perfectly honest, these are the same pictures that you've probably seen everywhere else. Nevertheless, this is Breakour Manor. This is the battery at Crisbeck, some short way north of the beach at Utah. Here you can see the view out towards the sea. The batteries at Crisbeck and Asville were supremely dangerous to the landing and were bombed and shelled repeatedly. Some of the batteries here, the bunkers, were named after, obviously after girlfriends. Here we can see an example of the German painting of the battery in an effort to disguise it. Here you can see the imprint of the wood shuttering that was employed in the construction of these bunkers. The remains of a grenade blast, I believe. Now, across the road is the Command and Control Centre. Unfortunately, when we visited, it was closed, but it's undergoing renovation, and when it opens, I think that's going to be absolutely fascinating to have a good look inside. Now, many of the big guns at Crisbeck were captured French weapons. Indeed, the Germans after 1940 made good use of captured French weaponry. Indeed, the tanks that were sent against the Americans at Lafayette Bridge were in fact French Char tanks. Now, the area around Angleville-au-Plain on that first night was the scene of bitter, bitter fighting, and the church there became a temporary aid station. It was staffed by two young medics from the 506th Parachute Infantry Regiment, Kenneth Moore and Robert Wright. In that church they treated many wounded paratroopers, including German troops, and indeed a young girl who had been injured in the bombing. Now imagine the scene. The church is full of wounded paratroopers, lying on the floor and in the pews, when suddenly a German mortar comes crashing through the roof and plummets to the floor, cracking a floor tile in the process, but miraculously doesn't go off. There was a gap of some seconds when a voice cried out, "Isn't somebody going to get that thing out of here?" And the unexploded mortar shell was removed and taken outside to the graveyard. A miracle by anybody's standards. On one of the pews at the back of the church, you can still see a bloodstain from one of the wounded paratroopers. And so on to the lovely town of Carentan. This is the memorial in the Place de République, with its distinctive arches off to one side. Now here's a period picture taken some days after the liberation of Carentan, and tragically just after this photograph was taken, a German 88 shell landed right in the square, killing several of the soldiers and a small young French girl who had been handing out flowers to the troops. Now, something I hadn't realised is that Carentan is in fact a port, a small one, but nevertheless. And this used to be the harbour master's office, and off to one side of the building you can still see the distinct line of machine gun fire. Point du Hoc. It's hard to know where to start with Point du Hoc. The whole area has been so heavily bombed. It's quite mind-blowing. Pictures just don't really do it justice. The size and depth of some of these craters are just vast. And I gather it still holds the record for the most bombed place on Earth. Now this is a view off to the east and to the west there, and here you can really get an idea of the sheerness of the cliffs that those rangers had to climb. Here you can see some of the gun emplacements that originally housed the 155mm guns that were later discovered at Breacaw Manor. Now this is the main observation bunker at Point du Hoc. A really truly remarkable piece of architecture, and here you can see the view that the Germans would have had on that cold blustery morning in June 1944. You can see evidence of fire here, and this was clearly a accommodation area. You can see the hooks on the ceiling that originally the bunk beds for the German troops were hung from. More of the rather well-preserved gun bunkers at Point du Hoc, and you can just see these vast lumps of concrete that had just been tossed around like they were polystyrene blocks. Such was the power of the bombardment. And so to Omaha Beach. We are right opposite the Verville draw, or exit from the beach, and right on the border of Charlie and Fox Green sectors. Now this is looking off west to Charlie sector. Now Mark and I had walked out onto this pier. It was an ideal vantage point for taking photographs of Omaha Beach, but he pointed out this enormous lump of concrete I'd just walked over was in fact the last remains of the Mulberry Harbour that was at Omaha Beach, and that was destroyed in the storms of the 20th and 21st of June that year. Now this is one of the German gun positions that looks out over Omaha Beach, and this is the view that it would have had. Now this is the rather impressive memorial to the National Guard at Omaha Beach, and the memorial to the wounded soldier. Next we drove off some way to the east to Colville-sur-Mer. This is largely at the junction of Fox Green and Easy Red. Then we wandered up to the American Cemetery at Colville-sur-Mer. Now, Mark had warned me this might be a, should we say, tricky part, but Mostly I was just thinking this is just so beautifully laid out and manicured. But as we wandered around, I started looking at all the crosses, and the thought just struck me. There are just so many crosses, just stretching as as far as the eye could see. I was fine until I started reading some of the names, and after that, I don't mind saying I kind of lost it. And for those of you who may have relatives buried there but have never had the chance to visit, you can rest assured they are being taken care of with the utmost care and respect. And then, just as we were planning on exiting the cemetery, Mark pointed out the, just enormous semicircular wall upon which was printed the names of all those servicemen who had no known grave, were either lost at sea or were just simply vaporised. Now, I just about got my head together when he pointed this out, and as you can see, there are just so many names. As we left the cemetery, we started to wander down towards the beach, and here is the memorial to the Big Red 1 and the memorial to the 5th Engineer Special Brigade. Now, this is a great shot of the classic German zigzag trenches that snake down towards the beach. Now we have some general shots of Omaha Beach. Now, this lump of concrete was at one point formed part of the German obstacles on Omaha Beach. But as the American troops landed, it became a first aid point. What happened was the medics were hiding behind the lump of concrete and literally just had to reach out and grab wounded soldiers and drag them in behind, because there was just this hail of lead coming from the bluffs above, and they just had to pull them in as tight as possible and there treat their wounds. The batteries at Longues-sur-Mer. Now, Longues-sur-Mer is just somewhat to the east of Omaha Beach, but just to the west of Gold Beach, the first of the British and Canadian beaches. The great thing about these batteries is they're relatively well preserved, and it's very easy to get a sense of what these batteries would have looked like all those years ago. Many of the guns are still in place, despite having been disabled by Army engineers. This is the main command and control centre at Longues-sur-Mer, and if it seems familiar, it is because it was used in the film The Longest Day. Now, this is the view looking east, where you can see the scattered remains of the Mulberry Harbour from Arromanches. And this is Arromanches, a really pretty little village come harbour. And then, as dusk fell, we decided to decamp to Port-en-Bessin to get something to eat. Port-en-Bessin featured in The Longest Day, doubling for Ouistreham. You can see the old castle on top of the hill, and if you remember the road where the nuns came striding down. This is the lock, if you remember from the film, where the French commandos had to scurry across under heavy gunfire from the casino. And up on the wall, if you look closely, you can still see the word Ouistreham that's been overpainted, but you can still just about see Ouistreham underneath. Now, this is the memorial to the Filthy 13. They were a demolition platoon attached to the 506. These guys earned themselves a bit of a reputation. You've probably seen pictures of paratroopers shaving their heads into Mohicans and daubing their faces with war paint. Well, these are the same guys, and a pretty fierce bunch they were too. Now, sadly, it was our last day, and we were homeward bound, but we had to stop in at Pegasus Bridge. Surprisingly, the bridge was up. This is apparently quite an uncommon thing. Now, what you see today is in fact a replacement for the original bridge, but it's a very near copy. The original bridge is actually in the Pegasus Bridge Museum, just nearby. Now, on the night of the 5th and 6th of June, the bridge was attacked by the Oxford and Buckinghamshire Light Infantry, commanded by Major John Howard. Their orders were to seize and to hold the bridge at all costs. Hold until relieved. Now, one of the British troops who landed that night was a young Captain Richard Todd, who later, after the war, became an actor and indeed played Major John Howard in the film The Longest Day. The Pegasus Bridge Museum is another excellent museum with some great exhibits. Oh, and remember I said I wanted a Sherman tank for my back garden? Scrub that. This is what I want. A Quad 50. This is magnificent. Now, this is the original Pegasus Bridge. And here you can see some battle damage, possibly grenade damage or bullet ricochets. A rather excellent reproduction of a British Horsa glider, and yes, these things really are as flimsy as they look, just light wood and canvas. This is the interior of one of the original Horsa gliders that landed that night. It's awaiting restoration. And this is the famous Café Gondry. During a lull in the fighting, Madame Gondry and her young daughter Arlette came out to serve the British troops sandwiches and cups of coffee, which were very much appreciated, I'm sure. I actually went inside and bought a rather nice commemorative tea towel, or drying up cloth, as the Americans would say. But to be perfectly honest, I just wanted an excuse to meet Arlette Gondry, the daughter of Madame Gondry.